The scriptures for today point us toward a God who's coming to save us, to rescue the blind and the deaf and the lame and the mute, to restore the fertility of the earth, to bring down the proud and raise up the humble. Jesus replied in the verse that we just heard, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised. The good news is proclaimed to the poor." In other words, the kingdom is here. The time you've been waiting for has arrived. God has showed up for Israel. Today is Gaudete Sunday, which is Latin for rejoice. And so in the season of the church, Lent is a season of fasting and penitence. It was originally 40 days, just like, Advent is a season of fasting and penitence. And it was originally 40 days, just like Lent. And they shortened it to 4 weeks leading up to Christmas. And so for the church, the way that the story progresses is that as we remember that God is coming, we prepare for that by confessing our sins and being aware of what's happening in our lives and in our world. And so in the middle of Lent, there's a Sunday where you get a break from all the fasting. And so they put the same thing in Advent. In the middle of Advent, there's Gaudete Sunday, the Sunday for joy, the Sunday where we take a break and we feast a little bit. And we remember that even though we're in the middle of a season of fasting and penitence, it's also a season for joy because Jesus has come. So that's where we're at today. We're in the Sunday of joy, Gaudete Sunday. There's a lot to rejoice about. So today we light the pink candle to represent that it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different than the other Sundays of Advent. Listen to the lyrics of the sacred Christmas carol, Gaudete. It was written in the 16th century, and this is a translation from the Latin. It says, "Rejoice, rejoice, Christ is born of the Virgin Mary. Rejoice, the time of grace has come. What we have wished for, songs of joy let us give back faithfully. God has become man, with nature marveling. The world has been renewed by the reigning Christ. The closed gate of Ezekiel is passed through, whence the light is risen. Salvation has been found. Therefore, let our assembly now sing in brightness. Let it bless the Lord, salvation to our King." It's a Sunday for rejoicing. And so the scriptures today point us towards that. The Old Testament reading that we heard from Isaiah is talking about the renewal of the earth and the restoration to the poor and all the good things that happen when God shows up. The psalm that we didn't even read this morning, instead we read Mary's song. But both of those point us to rejoicing for what happens when God shows up. But there's also another thread through these scriptures. These scriptures also point us to the need for courage, for strength and patience. So Isaiah says, "Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come to save you." In James, the verse that we heard read by Isaac says, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near." So in Advent, we're in this weird in-between time. And that's the time that we live in as Christians. Jesus has come, and it's something to rejoice about and celebrate, and the promises to Israel have been fulfilled, and yet we recognize it's not finished. Our world is still broken. There's still mess in my life and yours, in our neighborhoods and in our communities, in our world. And so we look forward to the promise when Jesus will return, and we live in this in-between with the presence of God in the Holy Spirit, the gift of God with us. And so there's both of these threads come together in Advent. And so today is supposed to be the day of joy, but I don't know about what it's like for you, but in my experience, joy can be elusive. It's often confused with feelings of happiness, although most of us would agree happiness and joy aren't the same thing. We kind of know that, but struggle maybe to define what joy actually is. The scriptures teach us to be joyful people as Christians, promising the joy of the Lord for followers of Jesus, and yet we often struggle to feel joyful. What is joy? What are we supposed to feel or think about this aspect of Christmas? And why do the scriptures remind us to strengthen the feeble hands and be patient and stand firm on Gaudete Sunday, Sunday for rejoicing? Is joy a feeling that comes from a remembering, from a gratitude that's funded by our memories of what God has done for us? Jesus in a manger 2,000 years ago. Does joy come from remembering? Or does joy come from faith in the future? Trust that the promises of God yet to be fulfilled will be fulfilled, that the God who's been faithful will continue to be faithful. And so we look forward to Jesus' return to make all things right. Or does joy come in the present, from our current experience of God with us, God's presence here by his Spirit? My proposal this morning is yes to all three. I think joy comes when all these threads come together. Jesus came, Jesus is present with us by his Spirit, and Jesus will come again. Past, present, future, gratitude, presence, faith. I propose that we're able to be joyful people when we notice and remember what God has done, and when we're paying attention to how God is with us in our present situations, and because we believe God is actively working for our future. Henry Nouwen describes joy this way. He said, joy is the experience of knowing that you're unconditionally loved and that nothing, sickness, failure, emotional distress, oppression, war, or even death can take that love away. Joy is the experience of knowing you're unconditionally loved. He roots joy in an experience and in the love of God. And that love of God spans the full story, past, present, and future. I believe joy comes from gratitude. And I believe joy also challenges us to be present here, now, because we're confident of our future. And I also believe joy, like anything worthwhile in our lives, takes intentional effort. It's a discipline. Joy isn't a discipline, but I think it's a gift from God that comes as we exercise certain disciplines. When we surrender ourselves to his Spirit. And I think that surrender is embodied. It's not just like an idea or some kind of vague notion, but I think we embody our surrender to Christ in the things we do, the way we live, the practices that we engage. We open ourselves to God by surrendering and engaging our whole selves, body, mind, and spirit. And we do that through practices. John Wesley called these kind of practices means of grace. We also refer to them as spiritual disciplines. But Wesley called them means of grace because he believed that they were means, they were practices through which we encounter God. Grace is itself an encounter with the God who loves us, the God who is love. And so through these practices, we encounter God and receive his grace, his presence, his love. And so I'd like to submit to you today two postures that I believe are essential for joy and one practice that I think can help us adopt those postures. And so this is a way to kind of embody a way of being human that I think can lead us toward a greater experience of joy. So the first posture is gratitude. I think gratitude is essential for joy. So listen to what the scriptures say. The desert, Isaiah writes, the desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. So we see creation rejoicing, full of joy. But why is the land shouting for joy? Here's what he says. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be open and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. I think Isaiah is describing the joy that was experienced in that first verse comes through the experience of the saving acts of God. The joy is the overflow of a thankful heart, the expression of gratitude for what God has done. But I believe a posture of gratitude has to be nurtured and maintained. It's so easily lost in the crush of life. It's easy to forget what God has done, to forget to be thankful. And so I think gratitude is connected to memory, to storytelling and ritual. So we do that as a church. That's part of our worship, our liturgy. Our liturgy means the work of the people. So as we gather together, you are not spectators, but you're participants in the liturgy, in the work of the people, offering our worship and our gratitude and our praise to God. And so we tell the story with one another. We listen to the scriptures. We light candles. We go through these little rituals that help us remember the story, remember who we are, remember what God has done. And when we remember, it helps us to be grateful. It helps us to be thankful to God because we're not forgetting, we're holding on to those things that God has done. And so sometimes we do that through testimonies. We'll share together, like we heard some praise reports in our prayer time this morning. This is some stuff that God has done in our lives this week. It's another means of storytelling. There's all kinds of ways, as many ways as there are creativity in this room and beyond. It can be personal, cultural, communal memory. There's all kinds of ways to remember. But the essential thing is the remembering. I think remembering helps us to be grateful. So what has God done in Jesus? Why do we remember and celebrate his birth, his life, his death, and resurrection? The remembering helps us to be grateful. And gratitude is a posture that's essential for joy. Remember that song, Gaudete? Another example of storytelling in our songs. The time of grace has come, what we have wished for. God has become man, with nature marveling. The world has been renewed by the reigning Christ. It's the story that we're part of. Gratitude is essential for joy. And I think remembering is essential for gratitude. What has God done in your life? And what methods have you employed to record and remember those experiences? One practice that can be used to do that is journaling. That's one that's been recommended to me through the years. I'm terrible at it. But every now and then I scratch something down in a journal, and every now and then I look back and I can remember as I read the record from years ago of things that God was doing in my life then. There's things like that we can do to remember together, to remember as individuals, and it leads us to gratitude. The second posture is presence. I believe presence is essential for joy, and by presence I mean being present in our current situation, not wishing for a preferred past or a hopeful future, but being here in the present. Listen to the scriptures again. Isaiah says, "Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come." So for Isaiah 2, he says to those who are in the midst of waiting for the promised salvation. He's giving a prophecy, looking forward to salvation that is to come. And in the midst of that, his word is patience and courage. Hope for future salvation, I think, can lend strength to our present circumstances. Joy comes through a posture of presence, being fully engaged here with what's happening now. And I think the strength of this posture comes from confidence in the God who's been faithful in the past, and he'll continue to be faithful in the future. And the kind of presence I'm talking about is not like a present absence, like waiting around till Jesus returns, or waiting around till I die, I think it's an engaged kind of present, an active celebration that God is with us. He's here with us now, even as we wait for his return. So Henry Nouwen, I gave you the quote that he talked about joy is the experience of knowing you're unconditionally loved. He's talking about an experience, something that's here. It's now. It's not an experience that you maybe can have in the future. And you're not just remembering an experience you had from 20 years ago, but you can experience God in your present. You can have hope in your present and joy in your present. I think Henry Nouwen is describing kind of a contentment in the present, an experience of joy that helps us engage our present circumstances, whatever they are, without pining for a preferred past or an imagined future. I think joy invites us to engage our present. So I've given you two postures, gratitude and presence. And the practice that I want to give you this morning, that I just offer this as something that I believe can be helpful if you want to try it. Maybe some of you have already. It's the prayer of examine. And so you have an insert in your bulletin that outlines how to practice this type of prayer. And it was developed by Ignatius of Loyola. He was a Spanish nobleman. He was the founder of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, in the 16th century. He was a Spanish nobleman and a knight, and he was wounded in a battle. He was hit in the legs with a cannonball when he was fighting the French. And he found himself forced to an invalid bed. And he was an active guy, like soldier, one of those people that's the life of the party, and he struggled to just lay in bed with nothing to do. And so he started to read. And he read biographies of Jesus. He read biographies of the saints. Sometimes he would just lay there and daydream, as you do before you have an iPhone to putter away on. And while he was in that bed, he began to discover a difference in the kinds of daydreams he would have and the way he would feel afterwards. So at times he would daydream about being well again and being a successful knight and all the kind of glory that he could win for himself and the women that he could woo and the life he could have. And other times he would daydream about being a saint, like the guys he was reading about. And he would daydream about the things he could do for God with his life if he surrendered his life to God. And what he began to notice was that after the daydreams about glory and fame, he felt depressed and dry and empty. And after the daydreams about godliness and saintliness, he felt energized and hopeful and joyful. And so he paid attention to that, and he began to discover a way of discernment, of being able to listen to how you're feeling and reacting to things as a way to discern the spirits, to discern where is God at work in my life, and how can I pay attention to what God is saying to me throughout my day. And so he eventually went on to he followed God instead of glory and fame, and started the Jesuits. And he developed a spirituality, a spiritual practice that Jesuits use. And the heart of that is this prayer of examine. And so in his spiritual practice, he names this feeling, the feeling of negative things he calls desolation, and the feeling of good things he calls consolation. And he uses those as a way to discern, what is God doing, what is God saying to me, and what's good and bad in my life, and how can I begin to aim my life more and more towards the good things that God is bringing into my life, the times of consolation, the things that bring joy and peace and contentment. And so the heart of that is this prayer of examine. And the prayer of examine is simply a prayer at the end of the day where you reflect back on your day with God and you pay attention to those feelings of desolation or consolation. And in a prayerful conversation with God, you listen to what God is saying to you about your day and how he was present in your day, how he's leading you through your day, and how he wants to lead you tomorrow. It's a simple practice. And so it's outlined on your paper. First step is becoming aware of God's presence. Then you review the day with gratitude. Pay attention to your emotions. You choose a feature from the day and you pray about it. And you look toward tomorrow. It's not very difficult. And the more you practice it, as with anything, the better sense you will have of those feelings of desolation and consolation. For those of you with children, if you're interested, I've actually developed a resource for how to do this as a family, kind of around the supper table, because I believe it can be a great way to help your kids learn to recognize what they're feeling and pay attention to what God is doing in their life. So I offer that to you as something that I hope can be helpful to help us begin adopting these postures of gratitude as we look back on our day, as we reflect on where God has been present. We can be thankful for what he's been doing in our lives. And also to help us develop the posture of presence, of being located here where we are, wherever God has put us, and being there, not wishing for somewhere else, but being where God has put us and listening to what God is saying to us about the place that he has us, so that you can be fully present in the ministry that he's given you, in your job, in your family, wherever you are. And I think that can lead us to joy, to contentment. And joy is not something we produce. It's a fruit of the Spirit. So it's a fruit of the Spirit's work in our life. It's a product that happens when we allow God to have more of us, when we allow the Spirit to have more access to us. And so these practices don't make you more godly. What they do is they open you to the Spirit. They open you up as you embody your faith, as you engage your body and your mind and your emotions and all of yourself in opening yourself up to the Spirit and allow the Spirit to work in you. The Spirit can make you more like Jesus and can produce the fruit of the Spirit in your life, one of which is joy. And I think this practice as well is highly appropriate for the end of a year as we head towards the end of 2019. And not just the end of a year, but the end of a decade. These kinds of practices, the prayer of examine, as we think back not just on our day, but on our year or on our decade. Where has God been at work? What is God saying to me about this? What is God saying, inviting me into in the future? So that we can be a people who are more and more open to the Spirit, more and more filled with the joy of the Lord, as we allow his presence and his Spirit more access into our lives. Jesus, thank you for the resources of your church that can teach us and help us and guide us. Father, as we go through the rest of our service today and into our week and into Christmas, God, I ask that you'd fill us with joy, that you'd help us to be grateful and present wherever you've put us, and develop your joy in our lives so that our lives, our conversations are attractive and a blessing to those around us. Amen.